The Berlin Experiment, the birth of a revolution. In Berlin, 1821, physicist Thomas Johann Seebeck was conducting what seemed like a simple scientific experiment. He joined two dissimilar metals together in a closed loop and applied heat to one side of the circuit. What happened next was unexpected. A nearby compass needle suddenly deflected. At first glance, it appeared to be a strange magnetic effect. But in reality, Seebeck had uncovered something far more profound. What Seebeck had discovered was not just magnetism, but the foundation of a completely new physical principle now known as the Seebeck Effect. When there is a temperature difference between two joined metals, that heat gradient can generate an electric current. In other words, heat itself could be turned directly into electricity, without batteries, without fuel combustion, and without moving mechanical parts. This moment was revolutionary because it revealed a law of nature that had always existed, waiting to be noticed. Seebeck did not invent heat or electricity. He uncovered the hidden relationship between them. That is why this science feels historical, undeniable, and unpatentable, like gravity itself. No one owns it. No corporation created it. It is simply a truth built into the structure of the universe. The Berlin Experiment was more than a laboratory curiosity. It was the birth of an idea that would later influence thermoelectric science, energy conversion, and the dream of generating power from wasted heat. What happened in that room in 1821 was not just an experiment. It was the beginning of a revolution. The architecture of dependence, corporate strategy. At the center of modern consumer electronics is a quiet form of dependence. The system worked because devices do not last forever on their own. They must be recharged, serviced, upgraded, and eventually replaced. In this narrative, power is not just a technical limitation. It becomes a protected business model. Every time a device runs low, an entire chain of revenue comes alive. Chargers, cables, replacement batteries, power banks, repair services, and next-generation upgrades. That is where the corporate strategy becomes more revealing. The real engine is not only the product in your hand, but the ecosystem built around its weakness. If a device could power itself for long periods through ambient heat or body heat, it would threaten some of the most reliable revenue streams in the electronics world. So the struggle is not only about innovation, it is also about who controls innovation, who owns the pathway to market, and who decides when a technology is allowed to become practical. This is where the idea of the patent portfolio enters the story. Thermoelectric and body heat related power concepts have existed in patent literature for years. And companies including LG and Panasonic have been connected to thermoelectric device filings, modules, and power generation technologies. Public records can support the argument that major firms accumulate intellectual property in this space, giving them leverage over commercialization, licensing, and competition. From a consumer point of view, that creates an emotional divide. People want longer-lasting, freer, more independent technology. Corporations, by contrast, often benefit most from controlled dependence. Products that remain useful, but never fully liberated from the charging cycle. That tension is what gives this story its stakes, corporate versus consumer. On one side is the promise of self-sustaining power. On the other is an industry built on making sure power is always something you must keep buying back. This does not mean every company is hiding a miracle device. It means the battle over energy independence in electronics is not just scientific, it is economic, legal, and strategic. And once you see that, the question changes. It is no longer simply, can this technology exist? The deeper question becomes, who benefits if it stays limited? The Cold War and modern validation. Proof of concept. This is where the story moves from theory to proof. Thermoelectric power is not a fantasy, and it is not a lab trick that only works under ideal conditions. It has already been used in some of the harshest environments on Earth. During the Cold War era, the Soviet Union deployed remote power systems in the Arctic that used thermoelectric conversion to generate electricity for unmanned facilities, such as lighthouses and navigation stations. In these systems, heat from radioactive decay was converted into electricity through thermocouples, allowing them to operate for extremely long periods with no moving parts and minimal maintenance. That alone proves the core principle. Thermoelectricity can deliver reliable long-duration power in places where batteries and conventional systems fail. The historical point matters because it destroys the idea that this technology is speculative. The science was functional decades ago. What we are looking at now is not a new miracle, but a mature physical principle being refined for modern use. The Cold War proved that thermoelectric systems could survive isolation, extreme cold, and continuous operation. Modern research is proving that the same principle can be miniaturized for the human body and wearable electronics. At MIT, researchers and MIT-linked reviews have described body heat as a usable energy source for self-powered electronics, noting that heat harvested from the human body is sufficient to power implanted stimulators, sensors, and wireless health monitors. MIT work on thin, wearable thermoelectric generators also frames body heat harvesting as a practical route for powering wearable electronics, rather than a theoretical curiosity. At CAST, researchers developed highly flexible wearable thermoelectric generators, specifically designed to produce electricity from the heat of the human body. CAST reported that a wristband-sized version could generate meaningful power from the temperature difference between skin and surrounding air, and later highlighted fiber-type thermoelectric devices that could be embedded into clothing, so body temperature could operate electronic devices. In other words, the research moved beyond raw voltage measurements and into clear demonstrations of wearable, self-powering use cases. For the Barcelona angle, the strongest safe wording is that researchers at the University of Barcelona have worked on integrating thermoelectric devices with sensing systems and on characterizing thermoelectric generators for practical field-like conditions. That supports the broader case that thermoelectric harvesting is being studied not just as an abstract material property, but as part of real sensor-oriented device design. I would avoid saying Barcelona definitively proved a body heat watch charger unless you have a specific paper in hand for that exact claim. The most persuasive conclusion is this. Skepticism can no longer hide behind the phrase, "it doesn't work." It has worked. It worked in brutal remote environments. It works in controlled wearable experiments. And modern studies show that as long as a temperature gradient exists, thermoelectric systems can continuously harvest energy for low-power electronics, such as sensors and monitoring devices. The debate is no longer whether the science is real. The debate is how far society is willing to push a technology that has already proven itself across history, military-grade isolation, and modern academic validation. One accuracy note, I would replace 1954 Soviet Union generators in the Arctic with Cold War-era Soviet Arctic thermoelectric generators, unless you want to cite a source for that exact 1954 date. The broad Soviet Arctic use is well documented, but the specific date is not firmly supported by the sources I checked. The physics of the human power plant. The human body is not just alive, it is warm, and that warmth creates a constant energy opportunity hiding in plain sight. If human skin is around 98 degrees and the surrounding air is near 70 degrees, that creates roughly an 18 degrees temperature gap, about 10 degrees. That gap may sound small, but in thermoelectric physics, even a modest temperature difference can be enough to drive charge movement through the right material. The principle is simple. One side is warmer, one side is cooler, and nature always tries to balance the difference. Inside a thermoelectric material, that imbalance pushes charge carriers from the hot junction toward the cold junction. In simple terms, heat agitates electrons on the warm side, and as they diffuse toward the cooler side, a voltage appears across the material. That is the Seebeck Effect in action. Not magic, not speculation, just electrons responding to a temperature gradient exactly the way physics says they should. The most important material in this story is bismuth telluride, usually written as Bi2Te3. It remains one of the strongest practical thermoelectric materials near room temperature, which is exactly why it shows up again and again in wearable thermoelectric research. When scientists build devices to harvest body heat, bismuth telluride is often the material at the center because it performs well in the temperature range where human skin meets ordinary air. Of course, the raw voltage from body heat is usually tiny, often in the millivolt range, so it is not directly ready to charge ordinary electronics. That is where an ultra-low voltage boost converter comes in. Chips, such as the LTC3108, are designed specifically for energy harvesting from thermoelectric generators and can start from inputs as low as about 20 millivolts. Then step that tiny signal up into usable regulated output voltages for sensors and low-power electronics. So the secret is not that body heat produces huge power. The secret is that modern power management electronics know how to take a very small signal and make it useful. That is what makes this section empowering. The physics is not complicated. Warm side, cool side, electron diffusion, voltage. Then a tiny converter lifts that voltage into something a circuit can use. Once the viewer understands that chain, the idea stops feeling impossible and starts feeling obvious. The Maker's Rebellion, DIY implementation. Now the story leaves the laboratory and enters the hands of ordinary people, because once you understand the principle, the system becomes surprisingly easy to imagine. A basic DIY thermoelectric build can start with 3 essential parts. A thermoelectric module, such as a Tech 12706 style Peltier device, an energy harvesting boost converter, such as the LTC318, and some form of thermal plates or heat sinking structure to keep one side warm and the other side cooler. The exact configuration can vary, but the logic never changes. The assembly idea is simple. One side of the thermoelectric module becomes the hot junction, placed against a source of warmth such as skin. The opposite side becomes the cold junction, exposed to air or attached to a surface that sheds heat more effectively. As long as the two sides stay at different temperatures, the module generates voltage. The larger and more stable the temperature difference, the more energy the system can harvest. But there is one important reality check. A Tech 1 12706 is widely used in experiments and DIY builds, yet it is primarily sold as a cooling module, not an optimized wearable generator. It can demonstrate the principle, but it is not the most elegant or efficient option for a body-worn charger. Research-grade and wearable-specific thermoelectric generators are usually designed to conform better to skin and perform more effectively at low temperature differences. So for storytelling, the Tech 1 12706 works as a symbol of accessibility. For technical precision, it is better described as a proof-of-concept DIY part, rather than a perfect end-state solution. That is where the rebellion enters the narrative. The barrier is no longer scientific permission. The barrier is only awareness, design, and execution. The laws of thermodynamics do not care about branding, market lock-in, or corporate strategy. If a hot side and a cold side exist, the effect operates. If the material is right, the electrons move. If the converter is sensitive enough, the circuit wakes up. Physics does not ask for permission. One wording note for credibility. Instead of saying free energy, the stronger scientific phrase is harvested energy or waste heat energy. It sounds slightly less dramatic, but it makes your argument much harder to attack. What the viewer is really accessing is not energy from nothing, but useful electricity from a temperature difference that already exists.